this section, we're going to be looking at a property of creative thinking known as divergence. It's the first of several strategies we're going to be looking at. These strategies are not necessarily separate and clearly defined and independent of each other. There's lots and lots of overlap. But by giving them labels and pulling them apart a little bit, we begin to understand the sort of component parts and the different nuances of creativity. But I do want to impress upon you the fact that creative thinking it's not a straightforward one or two or three particular styles of thinking. It's a very complex phenomenon. So to begin with, by looking at divergence, I want you to start by looking at these shapes right here. And I want you to ask or answer which one is different from all the others. So you can pause your recording here and just take a few minutes to think about it. Okay, so you probably chose one of the shapes, and you probably came up with some good reasons as to why it was different from all the others. Or you came to another conclusion, which was the logic you used to describe why any one particular shape here is different could be applied really to every one of the 5 shapes. So this habit of being able to just look at something, a question with multiple answers, and choose the correct answer is very typical of our normal way of thinking. We're trained, as it were, through our educational systems to find a single answer to a problem. But the answer to this problem is it's not a single answer. Any of these shapes is different from all the others, and for 5 different reasons. So something like this demonstrates that one of the habits of our thinking, which is this desire to naturally zone in and focus on one particular type of answer. Once we get there, we tend to stop. We give up. We're done. What I want to look at in this section is something called divergent thinking. This is where we provide multiple answers to solutions and ideas. We come up with lots and lots of ways of thinking about how we can approach or deal with something. So if we were to simplify the way we think in terms of problems, solutions, events, things we want to do, we could say there's basically 2 types. There's convergent thinking and there's divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is the one we've been trained in through all our educational life. It's what we normally associate with intelligence. And it's the idea that we logically narrow down lots and lots of possibilities to find the correct solution. So in other words, there's one answer. And through the accumulation of facts and information and data, we're able to arrive at that solution. So some convergent thinking questions might be these, for example. Not only things like answers on a test, how high is Mount Everest, but things like, why won't my car start? We turn the keys and nothing happens. We then go through a logical process of trying to eliminate likely possibilities for why the car won't start. So all of this is about taking the information and eliminating possible answers by focusing and narrowing down and coming onto the correct singular convergent answer. In contrast to this, divergent thinking is the idea of generating a wide range of solutions to ideas, or a wide range of ideas to a situation. Here it applies to a different kind of thinking. So the question, what is the capital of Malaysia, for example, it doesn't have lots of answers. And so divergent thinking is not the ideal technique to use for those sorts of questions, multiple choice questions, true or false questions, the kinds of things we find on many exams. But there are many, many situations in life, in our experience, where the solution is not a logical, obvious, necessary fact about narrowing down. And so some of the situations we might find that we use divergent thinking are things like this. How do you get to Moscow? There's many, many ways to get to Moscow, or all roads lead to Rome, and how do you get to Rome? Or things like relationships. How do you fix or develop or sustain or nurture? There's no one answer. There's lots and lots of ways to answer this question. Peace in the Middle East. If it was a logical answer, if it was a convergent kind of answer, meaning there is only one answer, with all the minds that we have working today, you think we would have figured it out. But it's probably going to take some really slightly bizarre, outlandish kind of thinking where people start to come up with ideas, lots and lots of ideas that are different. So this is one of the keystones of creative thinking, is this ability to diverge out from a situation or a problem or an event or a project and to generate lots and lots of possibilities. It's not something we've been trained in. Like I said earlier, our educational system is about finding the one answer. And what happens is when we find that answer, we stop, we shut down, we're done, we got it. The problem with that is that A, not all situations fit that kind of framework. And two, when we stop at what might be a suboptimal answer. It might not be the best answer for that particular situation. So convergent thinking tends to give us a few ideas that are very, very similar, if not totally singular. But divergent thinking raises the possibility of coming up with lots and lots of ideas and lots of different types of ideas. And this is crucial. So learning to think divergently is basically learning to have ideas. And there are very well-defined, tried and tested strategies, techniques, methodologies for training oneself to come up with ideas, and not only lots of ideas, but different types of ideas. But we're just not taught these sorts of things in the normal educational scheme of things. So divergent thinking is often used to test creative thinking. And testing divergence can happen in multiple ways. So alternative use tasks are probably the most popular. You ask somebody, how many uses can you think of for, a brick, a tennis racket, a bottle, for example. But lots of other tasks are used, and these are combined in various tests, the most famous of which is the Torrance test for creative thinking. But the problem with divergent thinking tests is that over time they have been studied and meta-studied, and that the correlation and the validity of such divergent thinking tests for predicting creativity is not always as clear as one might hope. But this is an issue more about the testing and how the testing is done and what it's testing than the particular mode of thinking. For example, many artists who work on a project don't necessarily generate lots and lots of solutions in a way that can be measurable or tested or archived by going through the biography. They might do it all in their heads. So divergent thinking is a key skill, the ability to imagine possibilities, but it's not always something we're very good at measuring. But on the divergent thinking test, it's instructive to understand that there's basically four areas in which somebody would be scored or graded. And these are important because they actually break down this idea of coming up with ideas or ideation in a way that gives us some language to talk about. So fluency would be, let's say you're asked how many uses can you find for a paperclip. This is literally the number of responses you can come up with. If you can come up with 5, that's different than somebody who can come up with 100. Fluency is really important because it goes back to that whole idea that we often stop at 1. But our best idea or our most interesting idea or our most successful idea might be our 5th idea or our 10th or our 100th. So the ability to be fluent in divergent thinking is really, really crucial. Originality. This is measured and scored on the statistical infrequency of a response. So if you ask somebody about something, a certain number of people are always going to answer in a certain number of ways, but if you get a response that kind of stands out, it's very different, it's very rare, we mark that as originality. Flexibility is the ability to move between categories, and we're going to discuss this in a moment. And then elaboration, the amount of detail or nuance you're able to develop for a response. So all of these 4 things would, on such tests, be measured and given a score. But we don't need to worry about the nature of the tests and the scores. Just the idea that coming up with ideas has several dimensions to it. So for example, if we were to look at a brick, and we were to be asked how many uses can you find for a brick, what would you say? So think about it for a second. Some of the things you might come up with are these. Use it as a doorstop, maybe a bookend, maybe squash a cockroach with it. Hold down papers. These are fairly typical and common responses. Others might include using it as an exercise weight, as a dumbbell for developing your biceps. Breaking a window to get inside the house or the car, maybe displacing water, stepping up like a step ladder or a stepping stone. So these are typical responses that many people come up with for finding a brick. So how would you develop this? How would you improve your ability to divergently think about the uses for a brick? Well, one method is to think about categories. Categories is a huge aspect of how we think in the real world and how we can train and develop our thinking. If we look at the stuff we just talked about and add a few more down here, a weapon, a sadist's pillow, to tether a balloon, a hammer, etc. These things all have something in common, and you can identify that commonality. You're on your way to understanding categories and assumptions. These are fundamental ways in which our thinking is structured. So these things, for example, could all be categorized under the idea of things you can do with the whole brick. Each one of these involve holding the brick, using the brick as an object in and of itself. The minute you identify this as a category, things you can do with the whole brick, and that's the hard part. How do you frame it? How do you put words to it? How do you describe it? But the minute you do that, you're able to look at that phrase, things you can do with the whole brick, and come up with another phrase, i.e. another category. So this category, things you can do with the whole brick, allows you to then think outside the category and ask the question, what if I was to change the brick, transform it, break it down in some way? So I'm no longer using the whole brick. What that does is it opens up a whole new realm of possibilities. Maybe we make a pigment for painting, exfoliating facial scrub, an abrasive toothpaste. Or maybe we alter the brick in some way to make it into a sculpture, or we make a game out of it, or we make gravel for our potted plants. But you can see here that what we've done is we've created a whole new category, changing the brick, its shape, its size, breaking it down into pieces. And the minute we start to transform the brick, or we recognize the idea of transforming the brick as a category, then we start to come up with more and more and more ideas. So this ability to recognize categories allows us to develop fluency, to come up with more stuff, but more importantly, it allows us to come up with originality and flexibility. So our object here is to be able to have not only lots of ideas, but to have different sorts of ideas, not just quantity, but quality. And so the minute you get to this stage, you realize you've got two categories. Well, if you have two, what about a third category? Can you think of a third category that you can use? Again, you might want to stop the recording for a second. Okay, so any ideas on the third category? One of them, maybe you came up with it, is using the brick for inspiration. So you're not using the brick as an object, you're not transforming the brick, but somehow the brick is being used. In this case, it might be used for writing a poem. You write a poem or a short story or a children's story about the brick. Or maybe you paint a picture of the brick, or write a story, or create a new religion around the brick. Maybe you put it on an altar. It's called brickism, I don't know. But you're using the brick in some sort of way that doesn't require you physically handle the brick. It doesn't require that you physically transform the brick. But the brick becomes useful in some other particular way. So we have three categories here. Can you think of a fourth category? Something that doesn't fit into any of these three, and I'll leave you with that thought as we move on. So categorization is a crucial aspect of how we think. In fact, all of our thinking at some level is structured and given meaning through categorization. We tend to think in what linguists call semantic frames, all sorts of ways in which we organize things in our thinking. But the problem with categorization is that there's the dark side, there's the other side of the coin. It limits and it constrains our thoughts. So a very helpful and useful tool, but at the same time, it has the other side to it. So assumptions. These are the things we take for granted, things that don't get changed. We think are just part and parcel of the way things are. Developing the ability to go outside of categories means developing the ability to question assumptions. And here is a good example where creative thinking is not very unlike critical thinking. And again, I want to impress upon you that the idea that creative thinking is this unique special category is a little misleading. A lot of the opposites in our thinking, critical, creative, etc., they actually share a lot in common. They're just sort of variations on a theme. So a good exercise in looking at this is to do something like this. I want you to draw a picture of an alien from another planet. All right, so I'm going to ask you to stop this audio recording and just doodle for 5 minutes or something an alien from another planet. Okay, so you've drawn your alien. Now I want you to score the alien. I want you to give it points based on the following qualities. So if it has just one eye, or lots of eyes, give it 1 point. But if you have 2 eyes, give it 2. And do the same for the arms and the legs. And if it has bilateral symmetry, meaning both sides are the same, kind of a mirror image, it doesn't have to be exact, give yourself 4 points. Now add up all the points that you have for your alien drawing. So the highest possible score you can have is 10, and the lowest possible score is 0. So what's your score? And which end of the spectrum, the high or the low, do you think is the most creative? Well, the answer turns out that the lower your score is, the more creative you were in your thinking. I asked you to draw an alien from another planet. Another planet could be extremely alien, strange, unusual, and not like something we are familiar with. So the fact that we imagine aliens being similar to the sorts of beings and creatures that we are means that we're operating from habits of thinking. The idea that they have 2 arms and 2 eyes and 2 legs, and that you cut them down the middle, they're exactly the same. If it really is an alien, strange, bizarre culture we have no idea of, there's no guarantee that they're going to have any of these things. But we tend to imagine things and think of things in ways that we expect or in ways that we're used to. And we call these invariants. We have a stock of ways of looking at the world and ideas and images that we assume are just unchanging, not unlike the sort of Steven Spielberg suburbia that we see in this picture. And that's a result of something which psychologists have recognized as functional fixedness, which is the idea that our thinking limits ourselves to using things and objects in a way that is traditionally used and thought about. In other words, a shoe is something you put on your foot to walk, a pen is something you write with, and we tend to think of things in terms of those functions, and we limit the ability of those objects to do other things. And this is a really important aspect of creative thinking and a really wonderful tool, is to try and imagine things and objects and uses outside their conventional understanding. Often this only comes in times of crisis or necessity, but it's a habit of thinking that we all possess. So one way of testing this is something called Dunker's candle problem, where you're asked to fix a lit candle to the wall in a way that the wax won't drip on the table below. And here are your items: box of thumbtacks, pack of matches, and a wax candle. So again, I want you to pause the audio and think about, how would you do this? Okay, so you might have come up with a solution. Could be ingenious, could be difficult, or maybe you didn't come up with a solution. But the object here is to think about your objects in different ways. And the prime solution to this problem is something like this, where the actual box, which we often think of as, oh, it's a container for the thumbtacks, can actually be used as a shelf. We tack the box to the wall, we attach the candle to the box, and we have the box as a shelf. Functional fixedness stops us from looking at things in this way. Boxes are only boxes, matches are only matches, tacks are only tacks. And so one of the habits we want to try to get into is recognizing functional fixedness when we see it and trying to see possibility in things rather than just seeing things in a stereotypical sort of way. And here are a few examples. Old chairs as towel racks and shelves, a brilliant use of the suitcase, and the old CD case, if you still remember those, for transporting your sandwiches, bagels, whatnot. Another brilliant use of mirrored sunglasses. Again, I said earlier that necessity is the mother of invention, so when you break your mirror and you don't have any recourse temporarily, this is when we start to get really creative. Tennis ball as earmuffs, and a leaf blower. Or you wanted to have a melted cheese sandwich, but you don't have a toaster oven, you have a toaster. How many of us ever thought of turning it on its side and using it that way so the cheese doesn't drip down into the toaster? Or, here we go, baking a cake with some scissors and a drill. Artists do this all the time. They often look at materials and think, how can I imagine or reuse those materials in a way that is not based on their particular function? Here, these plastic bottles and the light shining through are used to project an image onto the back wall. And this technique is taken to a really high level of sophistication and development by the Japanese artist Shigeo Fukuda. What you have here is a pile of cutlery, knives, forks, spoons, etc., which he's attached to make a conglomerate of metal, which when lit from above makes the image of a motorcycle. His work is pretty well known all over the world. Here's another example right here. Same concept, and creating a ship. Artists also use this technique to sort of jolt us out of our habitual thinking by combining objects with bizarre things. So here you're combining a teacup and spoon with fur. And here we have Brian Eno's 77 million paintings. The artist, musician, producer, composer Brian Eno looked at paintings and questioned the whole assumption that paintings were these static images on the wall. He said, well, why can't paintings change? We come into rooms and we turn on music to fit our mood. What are we feeling like listening to? But we tend somehow not to do that with visual art. We walk into a room, whatever visual art's on the wall, we sort of accept. But what if we had the ability, he said, to actually change the visual art in our daily world as readily as we change the music on our music players? And so he created this painting, as it were, called 77 million paintings, by which he programmed certain algorithms and images into the computer and had them change slowly over time. So it's kind of like a giant screensaver, really. But here you can see people lying down to look at his painting, quote unquote, of light, but everything slowly morphs, and he's estimated that there's roughly 77 million images in this work. This work actually also premiered in Sydney at the Opera House, is projected onto the Opera House in 2009. So this whole idea of categories and the ability to think outside of categories was sort of highlighted by Borges with his writing The Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge, where he pretended that he had found a document about a Chinese emperor and how the Chinese emperor divided up the animals in his kingdom, and he created a list as such. What we see when we look at this is what appears to us to be highly incoherent, illogical, contradictory ways of categorizing animals. But what this brings to the surface is the idea of the nature of our categories. We tend to assume that categories are natural, they're fixed, they describe the way things actually are out there in the world, and we forget that categories to a large extent are not necessarily arbitrary, but socially constructed. We make categories, and that different cultures make different categories for different things. In other words, how they structure the world varies not just at a personal level, but also at a social, community, and cultural level. And so the question comes up is, what are categories? But more importantly, categories are fluid. They can change. They can be adapted, just like our perception. So there are various methods for generating ideas by breaking out of categories, by breaking out of habit. One of them is to find the invariants or the categories and examples of fixedness you might have in your everyday life and play with them. So if you are the kind of person who does yoga, try and do a yoga session where you're not allowing yourself to do any of the traditional yoga moves. You have to invent your own yoga. It's a fascinating technique. Um, Exercise, try it. Or new ways of doing anything, swimming, walking. What about trees and plants? We're used to, what the books tell us, but invent your own names, and maybe your names are based on what you see, the shape, the color, the quality of the tree or the plant. This is an exercise where you know, children love this sort of stuff. They do it naturally. We have to remind ourselves to do it. And so creating new names for trees and plants, for example, take a kid with you and go for a walk in the forest or the gardens and tell the kid you're going to make up your own names, and you'll be amazed at the sorts of things you come up with. Other ways of doing this are techniques that we're going to be exploring throughout the course, such as randomness, chance, play, and conceptual blending. But there are also techniques that have been explored. The 20th century was notorious for the development of looking at ways of coming up with ideas and ways of questioning assumptions about what is and what is not art. And one of the leading art movements in this respect was something called Dada, which emerged right after World War I. And this was an art movement that composed visual artists, musicians, poets, writers, and their whole idea was multifaceted. At one level, it was a reaction to World War I. They felt that European civilization and culture, which prided itself in being the highest attainment of culture in the world, post-colonial Europe, they thought to themselves, well, how could this high achievement of quote-unquote civilization devolve into such brutality and inhumanity to fellow human beings through the mechanization of war? This is the first war that had, airplanes and machines and bombs dropping from the sky and tanks and that sort of technology. And so they felt that the whole idea of Western European culture as a civilized state of being was basically a sham, a lie, a veneer on a very animalistic, brutal, basic human nature. And so they sought, in one aspect of their work, to mock traditional forms and standards of how to do things. But on the other side, there was a very constructive way of deconstructing and taking away the categories and the assumptions associated with how does one make music, how does one make poetry, how does one make art. And so they began to combine various elements that were unusual. Man raised the gift with the iron and the nails. It has a sort of visceral feeling and quality. So they would challenge the assumptions we have about objects. They were famous for their typography and their collage and the way that these are posters for events. How they sort of jumbled and threw stuff together, thinking, why would I be bound to certain strictures of organization? I can be relatively disorganized, play with scale and size and shape. And so they were not averse to being challenged by all these, or challenging rather, all these ways of doing things. Out of this grew the development of collage. Picasso invented collage, but the Dadaists really took collage to a new level. This eventually morphed into Surrealism, a later art movement, which included many of the early Dadaist artists, where they tried to be less deconstructive of society and more reconstructive by building new dimensions and new realities in a society. And so it took them from these collages into bizarre, unusual worlds that led to dreams and the unconscious and exploring that. It's the first time people had seen images like this, really. Artists were juxtaposing elements like Magritte or Dali here, that one would often come across maybe just in dreams or fantasies or drug-induced stupors. And so they were exploring other ways in which to image and think about the world. One of the techniques they developed was automatic drawing. And here the artist just starts doodling basically with a pencil or pen or ink or paint and tries to sort of inhibit any sort of conscious control or idea about what to do in order to let the unconscious come forth, uh, create some random imagery, and from that be able to derive or pick and choose something in there that came from a natural sort of spontaneous level of being. The technique that we're going to be looking at next is conceptual blending, which is the idea of taking two things, putting them together, and making something totally different. And that'll be the subject of our next talk.